We've just kind of finished working through just that sort of initial light, quick pass through wildlife resources. Whether or not that felt light and quick to you, remember we have entire majors devoted to just wildlife management. So, next up we're talking about the human and cultural, experiential, infrastructural resources within our layer stack. Building up from landscape all the way up to outer sky and outer space. And what this means for us is that we're going to spend a bunch of time on this human layer because it's such a thick and complex layer with lots of layers, if I really want to belabor the metaphor a bit. Then we'll race through air resources as kind of our final set of resources, and then shift over into scenarios for your parks. So, like we were talking about last week, what we really don't want to do is leave your assessment and your understanding of your park's specific array and arrangement of resources to the last couple weeks of class. That's going to be a pretty cramped, and usually, honestly, what happens is that it's a kind of a piss poor planning setup. Okay? So, just as a friendly reminder, crack open your notebooks outside of class, and for each of these things as we're talking through them, figure out what your particular park's footprint on this particular layer is. Okay, so you probably know what the wildlife species at your park are. Just take like half an hour per layer, not a huge assignment, and do this before we get into scenario work, because it's going to come pretty fast after we're finished with this, okay? I don't want anybody to be straggling behind on that. Any announcements for the good of the cause before we begin? Okie doke, just a friendly reminder that if you weren't with us on the canoeing field trip, you want to make sure to get your field trip alt assignment in as soon as possible, so that that doesn't fall on the end of the semester and end up being kind of a swipe and a promise kind of an effort. Okay? Cool. So let's talk about the human resources, plural, layer, and how that kind of splits out into a whole bunch of other things. So with things like bedrock, it's pretty straightforward. With human layer, it's much, much more complex because it is everything in the past for human action. Things or places like Mesa Verde, for example, an entire human colony or settlement for some centuries, now not actively lived in, but viewed and managed as a precious, unique, and irreplaceable resource, an opportunity to experience that resource. So Mesa Verde, if you've never been there, is not a particularly large place. It's in the Mesa Tableland, as in the name, of southwestern Colorado. And so you drive up one road, and there's a little bit of stuff up on top of the mesa and some hiking trails and stuff like that. And then in part of the sort of cliff edge, we have hundreds, not just the Cliff Palace that we're all familiar with, but hundreds of spots where it's sheltered by overhang in the sandstone, and there are archaeological traces, remains, granaries, home sites, religious sites, burial sites, and just living spaces. So that is one kind of resource. And in our human resource set, we're going to file that as a cultural resource, right? We are preserving and trying to rediscover in an informed and archaeologically safe way what the human condition has been for anybody else in the past, so that we can learn from them, so that we can appreciate them, so that we can understand where we come from, right? The struggles of the people to survive in and around Mesa Verde, Chacoan ancestral culture more broadly in southwestern, what is now America. Like, there's a lot of the human story that is there. And a lot of the people who live there in Aboriginal or indigenous ways these days can directly trace their lineage back to some of those folks. So this is like the opportunity for us as foresters and park rangers to help folks preserve their great-great-great-great-great-grandparents' homesteads, to put it in kind of a Western vocabulary or mindset. These days, if your extended family has a day, maybe like Memorial Day each year, where folks get together and you head to the family cemetery and you just trim back the previous year's weeds, and maybe you put a little American flag at the grave sites, the cenotaphs of any of your ancestors who are service members or were. This is a recognizable thing. Like, that's really important to a lot of families. It has been said by people who are smarter and more eloquent than I am, and I'm paraphrasing, that you learn a lot about a people, a society, in terms of how they treat their dead. Like, it's just a bunch of dead bodies, right? They can't do anything for us, so how do we respond to that? Do we let bodies kind of decay in the street? Do we build palaces for the dead, like some previous cultures have, or at least some of their dead? Do we do something in between? So, when we are given the opportunity, or presented with the opportunity to, as a country, fold places like Mesa Verde into our efforts to protect, to preserve, but also to provide access and opportunity and interpretation about and research focused on, that's a pretty big responsibility. And the way the laws are written, it's forever. Like, we can't do anything to these places, period, that would allow any kind of permanent degradation of the quality of this place and the respect for the peoples represented by it. Okay? So, that's pretty serious. And, you know, this kind of gets misfiled in a lot of people's heads as, okay, so we're archaeologists, right? No, we are not archaeologists. The park has staff archaeologists. There are archaeology staff working full-time year-round at Shawnee National Forest, right? This is a thing that is directly aligned with and adjacent to forestry and land management, being a park ranger. But as park rangers, we're not necessarily, for the purposes of this class, focused on the archaeology, the excavations, the site reconstructions, the anthropology of understanding peoples in a different context, but who fundamentally might be similar to us in a lot of ways, like putting their pants on one leg at a time each morning, if it was a culture that was a pants-using culture. Okay? And if they weren't a pants-using culture, why not? Those are interesting questions. Questions we can learn a lot about us, learning about them. So, archaeological sites, we're gonna focus on those for today. And we're also gonna sort of zoom forward in time to talk about historic sites. So, for the purposes of this class, we're gonna file everything that is pre-writing in archaeological. Okay? And the Park Service, where there are human arc sites or human historic sites, so similar kinds of places like national military parks, battlefields, national heritage corridors, and so forth, like the Blackstone River or the Cuyahoga River. Those are post-invention of writing, and are filed under the historic tab, but they're kind of similar in that we're using archaeological and historic research tools to understand them and to start to interpret them to the visiting public. But there are some fundamental and profound differences between what we can say about historic places, because we have a whole bunch of recorded history about them, versus archaeological sites where we're doing a lot more reconstruction and inference and indirect understanding of what things were like then based on measurements, models, things like how long did people at Mesa Verde live on average, based on remains in the area and things like dental records or remaining bones and so forth. We can do some things like that. Atomic chemical analysis, ICP, AES, that kind of stuff. You burn minute samples of some of that bone, let's say, destructively at 8,000 degrees under an inert argon field, and very, very, very intense radio waves. You get this weird silver blowtorch light, and you measure how that light changes in its color and brightness as you pass samples through it that are immediately consumed and essentially vaporized and atomized, and they burn different colors. So we can figure out, was there a bunch of arsenic in these people? That, as it turns out, is a thing in some of these southwestern settlements because you settle around water, and arsenic is a highly water-soluble element. And so everybody gets the same good idea to settle around this one water source in the desert, and after a generation, each one of those settlements collapses. Arsenic poisoning over time. So, pretty cool stuff. We can figure that stuff out by practices of archaeology and forensic chemistry and stuff like that. But Forest Service, they're managing a whole bunch of archaeology sites, even just on the Shawnee, right? But the Shawnee National Forest, most of our national forests weren't really created to preserve and protect and do research on and interpret those archaeology sites. In the national park system, places like Mesa Verde are absolutely set aside for this point, right? So Forest Service has a multiple use, sustained yield, kind of a conservation mandate sort of a place. Like they got a box to check for every kind of thing, right? Rangeland, clean water, timber products, non-timber products, recreation, mining and mineral rights, grazing, all that stuff. The Park Service doesn't have to worry about all of those things. It just has to worry about preservation of these non-duplicatable resources, right? We cannot take a utilitarian value approach to running Mesa Verde because there's no replacing it. We can't farm up or build a replacement Mesa Verde at somewhere like Disney World and call it the same thing. So, this is a hard ironclad mandate to protect these resources to the absolute highest standard possible, which is tricky with stuff like climate change. Okay, so we've got archaeological resources like Mesa Verde, like Chaco Canyon, like all of the Native American sites, the shelters along the bluff line here in southern Illinois. Those are archaeological resources. And then we've got more recent stuff like the historic, right? Those national battlefields. Anybody been to a national military park, national battlefield, Shiloh, Gettysburg, Wilson's Creek? Okay. There's a lot of folks who have a lot of fun getting to understand, getting to know, getting to experience kind of first and a half hand what the American experience has been at different times based on visiting things like national battlefields. So it kind of hits different learning about Gettysburg when you're standing at Gettysburg and the sign in front of you is explaining, right, see that little rise up there? That's where like 3,000 people were gunned down in wave after wave of just human mulching with 50 caliber soft lead bullets that flew so slowly they had enough contact time with your clothing to set it on fire on its way in. So you can imagine that as you're standing there, and that hits different, no pun intended, versus just reading something like that in a book. So there's something to the resource of the land of a national battlefield, which is typically a bunch of farm fields, if it's a Civil War battlefield. Most of them were fought in just minor outlying settlements of larger cities. That's historic. And you learn something about yourself by learning about those people, mostly men, who lost their lives in those places. And you can sort of foster that sense of connection from the view of the park ranger of, hey, you didn't just show up on Earth one day. All of this stuff brought you to right here. When you're standing at Gettysburg Battlefield, you can have a talk about who are we as a society? Who do we want to be? And how do we figure that out? How many wars, what kinds of wars, and wars for what reason do we fight? To answer the hard question of who do we want to be as America, corporately, and as Americans, individually. Does that make sense? So this is a pretty high and lofty calling to be a park ranger at a national historic site, or a national battlefield, or an archaeological site like Capitol Reef, for example. There's a ton of archaeology, petroglyphs, stuff like that at it. Okay, and then our third sort of split out of the 1/3 of our human resource layer, the cultural layer. We have the modern cultural resources. So this would be the places and the human experiences attached to those places that are still more or less basically within living memory. So, for example, out in California and down in like rural Mississippi and Nevada, and some pretty uncomfortable places to live. The United States operated something like 1 to 2 dozen concentration camps where they bust a whole bunch of Japanese Americans under armed guard, to these remote spots like on the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, right? Those beautiful White Cat Mountains that sort of form the spine of California, over on its east side. One of those camps is called Manzanar. And so the American military built a whole bunch of basically pallet wood shacks up in the California mountains, and through thousands of Japanese Americans and their children. Like, this is whole families. It's not just people who were looking sus, as the youth of today might say, during World War II, as Japan launches its attack on Pearl Harbor. It was an uncertain time, and there were a whole lot of Japanese Americans living in the United States by the time that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And so there's this open question of, who are we as a country? Can we trust these people? Are we a country, do we want to be a country that takes men and women and newborn babies, pregnant families, to hastily built concentration camps up in the mountains and just kind of stick them there during the course of a war? So, for example, if Russia invades Ukraine and America, the United States, decides it wants to be a military ally of Ukraine or of Israel, as that armed conflict is really blowing up right now, do we take all the Palestinian Americans and throw them in concentration camps? Do we throw all the Russians living in the United States in concentration camps? Do we expel them? Right? If Russia attacks American military assets in Ukraine, then do we pull the trigger on Russian Americans? What do we do? Right? That's an open question. That's a hard question. It's an ugly question with real consequences. So for the pregnant women who were bused up to Manzanar, and any of the other 23, 24 other concentration camps, their infant mortality rate was 10 times higher than it is outside those camps. So little tiny babies, newborns, are dying because of a political and military and national security choice that the United States federal government made at that time, right? So not all casualties in war are combatants. And when something like that happens on your watch, that's a really difficult thing to talk about. It's a whole lot easier to go to work each day and focus on war fighting. than it is to fend off a lot of pretty unhappy questions from your own citizens about, hey, my neighbor is gone, and later on you find out they almost had 2 kids while they were locked up in this concentration camp, and both the kids died because of really harsh conditions and essentially no medical care, right? So you take people not quite back to the Stone Age, but not real far past it either. And it's pretty remarkable when you think about it that the American federal government, in the guise of the National Park Service, is having any of these conversations. So sometimes being a forester, sometimes being a park ranger isn't just about keeping trees standing so that we move towards older growth or higher stand quality or more board feet or more expensive board feet of older growth, high economic value timber. Sometimes it's asking us, what was your experience in World War II at one of these camps if your family was there? Okay. And in the environmental interpretation class, we watch a short documentary video about life in one of those camps, as told by a whole bunch of people who lived in those camps and their children. Because when you do something like that, you change not just the life of that family at that generation or those generations in those camps, but there are long echoing effects afterwards, right? So pretty much everybody who got rounded up into those camps lost their jobs or their careers or their businesses. Most all of them lost their homes. So that when they were released in 1945, a bunch of them stayed till 1946 because where the fuck are they gonna go, right? So our government now has this conversation through the National Park Service every year at these camps, or what memorial sites have been built at the camps as National Historic Sites, to talk about this stuff, to set up in the visitor center a whole bunch of electric griddles so that the former internees, most of whom have passed away now, but their families can gather and make things like spam sushi and talk about this stuff, and then extend that conversation forward to, for example, how are we going to treat Muslim Americans when September 11th, 2001 happens? And I know that for most of you guys and gals, that happened right about when you were born. But that was a seismic shift in what it felt like and what it meant to be an American in that moment. I was in college when that happened. And it was super weird for a whole lot of Muslim Americans who had nothing to do with Saudi terrorist cells or anything like that. Like, they're just trying to go to school, or they're just trying to have their family or live their life as Americans, and facing a whole bunch of racism, right? So the conversations that you can have at these parks, as centered, as facilitated by the National Park Service, that's a resource, because those conversations matter. Keeping those drum beats of, hey, this stuff happened on our grandparents, our parents, our watch. We don't like some of the side effects of those choices those people had to make. So let's keep talking about it so that we don't forget, so that we don't blunder into the same dumbass decisions again, so that nobody else has to suffer the way so-and-so did, okay? So that's a pretty meaningful conversation, right? And this is also not exactly unique across the world, but it's also not super common either. So there are a whole lot of governments, a whole lot of countries around the world that are very happy not to even acknowledge that some of this stuff ever happened, right? So the Japanese government, for example, to this day will not even acknowledge a bunch of stuff that Japanese soldiers did during World War II in mainland Southeast Asia. All right, so when you hear of things like the rape of Nanking and so forth, there are a lot of governments who are very happy to let that stuff be either just not talked about or legit actively denied. Like, I reject your reality and substitute my own because mine's more comfy. So, we get to be foresters. We get to help people engage in this stuff, and we get to manage the sites so that folks can engage with this stuff in a meaningful way, right? So what stories are you going to surface at Gettysburg? What stories are you going to acknowledge but not really spend a bunch of board feet, if you want to think of it, of sign space talking about? Which ones are you going to put an asterisk next to in the visitor center and say, you know what, this is in our records, but some research has kind of suggested there might be some alternative perspectives to this particular narrative. Okay? This is very important in this day and age, where we have generative AI and state-level sponsored misinformation campaigns against you and against me 24/7 by other countries, and sometimes at various points in America's history as well. Okay, so we've got historic, we've got modern cultural resources, we've got archaeological, and the goal here is to do good forestry land management to preserve those archaeological or historic, etc. resources in as intact a state as possible. So, that's a tricky thing, because a place like Gettysburg isn't in the same land use now that it once was. So Gettysburg, the town nearby, has since grown a decent little bit. It's a beautiful little town. And some of the places where parts of the battles were fought are now like underneath buildings and stuff like that. So in some cases, our job as Park Service folks is to come in behind acts of Congress that take that land out of private ownership, like at Ozark Scenic Riverways on our field trip, and turn it into a park, which means raising most of the old buildings, doing destruction, demolition, that kind of stuff, to get that stuff out of there, and then return it to a past or historic land use. So the American National Park, anybody like to do woodworking? Okay. If you like woodworking, the historic and modern cultural side of the Park Service and state park services are like it as well, just without the same horsepower. National Park Service runs a world-level, world-class, sort of authentic, period-accurate construction and renovation program at Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry, West Virginia is a really cool, very, very historic town from Civil War stuff. The Appalachian Trail runs right through there. They've got this whole group of experts that do everything from like shaking shingles like the right way with the right tools, exactly how it was done back in the day, because when you have wooden structures with wooden shingles, those don't last forever. And what if those are the historic structures, Colonial Williamsburg, for example, that you're trying to keep? And you can't just go to Lowe's and buy like fresh tar shingles and slap that over the old stuff. You got to replace them at some point. And so they have to go back to the period accurate and correct way that it was all done by hand back in the day. Most of that knowledge is never more than a generation from being utterly lost. There are a few books about how to shake shingles and do a whole bunch of like home and farmstead type stuff. When you go on either summer camp or we go to Home Place, an 1850s era living farm, which had a whole bunch of like old farm structures and stuff like that, disassembled, trucked in, and reassembled like shingle by shingle in the right place. It's that kind of a thing. Like it's the actual old hand squared beams of lumber on every one of those structures. Every stitch in the quilts on site is loomed, it is woven and then sewn into a quilt out of wool that came off that farm, or other farms operated like it that provide additional supply. Pretty cool stuff. So, if you like doing woodworking and you like making your own tools out of wood so you can do the woodworking, like this could be a thing for you. You could be a world-class expert with the Park Service doing this kind of historic restoration work. And there's also the historic ecology restoration. So this is not ecological restoration towards some arbitrary nature standard. It is very specifically tied to what was the exact vegetation cover at the area we call Gettysburg National Military, National Battlefield. Like, was this area closed canopy? Was it open? What about these invasive species we find on a walk there? So what in 1862, 3, whenever Gettysburg was, what was the exact composition on site? And this is something that the Park Service didn't actually get exactly right. So if you ask Groninger how deer management was going at Gettysburg, you might cause him to age just a little bit more. Because over the years, the Park Service let Gettysburg aft forest when it was a whole bunch of farm fields originally. And so kind of from the 90s into the aughts and so forth, the Park Service went through a huge historic records search to get everything they could possibly do, and a bunch of dendrochronology effort and stuff like that, trying to figure out exactly what areas were in farm and what areas had afforested in the 150 or so years since that battle to now. So 1865 to 2015 is 150 years. Okay? So the sesquicentennial of the Park Service, 150-year anniversary of each of these battles, helped kind of trigger, or the preparation or the run-up to that sesquicentennial celebration helped trigger a whole bunch of restoration ecology, and to a very specific and particular definition of what is correct, what is the goal. Very cool stuff, right? So over the years, right, as the farmers get pushed farther west and so forth, as eastern fields start playing out a little bit, farmers move away, villages spring up where it used to be fields, or those fields go back to timber plot, afforest, and visitors to Gettysburg had no idea how the battle actually went, because the sign for this big open field skirmish where people were just getting blasted to bits by direct cannon fire and grape shot, stuff like that. Like, it was just this tangle of early to mid-successional growth, just low quality timber plot that was not accurate at all. And so it was very confusing to people, and so people were leaving one of our most sort of hallowed military history sites kind of more confused than when they arrived, because what the signs were telling them about didn't match what they were physically looking at all. So part of being a park ranger is being a good historian and a good detective of what exactly can we find in historic records, like the margin notes in somebody's bio from the 1860s. Just a little mention of farmer so-and-so's garden plot. Oh, it's going gangbusters this year. We can't find any record of that garden plot, but we clearly know that it existed. So let's go back to it. Let's use ground penetrating radar to find things like evidence of garden plots and so forth that have been long since obscured. Pretty cool stuff, right? So park rangering isn't just writing people speeding tickets in beautiful places. It's doing all of this stuff. It's figuring this out. Wait a minute, Gettysburg, what we are giving people doesn't match what was actually there. That's a problem, right? And then just completely overhauling that place to bring it back to what it once was, and paying local farmers to plow and seed those fields with period appropriate crop varieties and so forth. So it looks and feels and it is genuinely like what it once was at that particular moment. So pretty cool work getting done in modern cultural administration and management. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so Let's jump forward from the cultural sort of sub-layer of the human resources layer into the experiential layer. So this is an intangible resource. This is a conceptual one, but we can tie this to every trail, every vista, every campsite, every visitor center, every amphitheater talk, every guided tour, every chance you have to rent a tandem bike, sea kayak, a caving exploration, pair of overalls and boots and hat and backup battery and light, and then another backup battery and light, because you always have 3 in caving. That's all experiential resources. So when people show up, what can they do? Or what can they at least perceive? And out of that much larger set, what can they safely and ecologically, sustainably, and socially responsibly do? So, this is the visitor's access to the opportunity provided by our third class of human resources, infrastructure. So, infrastructure is the built environment of your park. How many miles of trails? What are those trails surfaced in? Where do they go? What do they bring you close to? What do they keep visitors far from? How are those trails interconnected? Topology. All of that stuff is infrastructure. What are the roads? How many flush toilets does your park have? How many pit toilets? How many composting toilets? How many portalets? How many historic style outhouses? How many big open rock faces above tree line where there's no soil microbe activity, where people are smearing their poop to sterilize it under sunlight, because that's the only thing you can do, or pack it out, right? That proportion of flush toilets to smearing poop, that's all an infrastructure resources question, okay? So your park has a whole bunch of so-called parkitecture. Because when you go to a park and you find a table to sit at, it's probably not like a table anywhere in this building. There's kind of a parky table. We might call it a picnic table, right? Okay. And anybody ever been to a bathroom at a park or forest where the walls of the bathroom are poured concrete, but they're textured like wood? Think about that for a second. Some asshole had to spend effort making concrete look like wood and finding like a brown stain for it that's cellulose adjacent, right? We don't have a lot of hot pink outhouses in parks. That's parkitecture. It's a very, very specific application or distillation of anything we could do to solve the poop problem, but that works and it fits and it's not obtrusive, but it's high functional. We're a place that sees millions of people a year, okay? You ever been to a music festival or a sporting event and the bathrooms smell like it's a very popular music festival or sporting event? Or you ever been to like the French Quarter in New Orleans and just like walk down the street and smell the vomit and urine, right? That's how all of our parks would be if we didn't have highly functional, well-designed, properly placed, and high enough capacity infrastructure. We're gonna have a whole lot of people getting real sick, and some people die, if we can't solve the drinking water problem for people, right? If you're a backpacker, you pretty well gotta be able to make your own water safe to drink. But for everybody else, it's on us, the park rangers, to make sure that is available. So the infrastructure resources, properly selected, properly maintained, properly used, properly sited, placed on the map where they should be, those give way to or help surface the core experiential resource, okay? So a trail at Rocky Mountain National Park that goes up to Long's Peak on a historic route called the Keyhole, that's an infrastructure resource. We manage that. We have a whole bunch of research doing a bunch of my own research that figures out how to build a sustainable trail according to things like physics and climate change and soil particle adherence and shear strength and stuff like that. What that work does is set the stage for, provides access to or opportunity to access the experience of threading the keyhole. Okay. So, nobody is going to your park to enjoy the infrastructure resources, but they need the infrastructure resources to go for what they are trying to enjoy. That once-in-a-lifetime hike through the keyhole, or that midnight full moon hike along the precipice cliff line at Acadia National Park. When you look out and the moon is so bright, you can see whales surfacing like a couple of miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. You see their plumes. Pretty cool stuff. Looks like a geyser steam vent. That's a pretty cool experience. And the Precipice Trail is a pretty cool trail. And sometimes the infrastructure resource is pretty clearly providing the experience. So, Precipice Trail, a via ferrata trail, where you're going up a cliff that's kind of shaped like this. And you've got rebar handholds and short bridges, 5-10 feet long. And by bridge, I mean a bunch of bars of rebar hammered into the cliff face and then bent over, and you just walk across them. And sometimes with the really fancy and expensive via ferratas, you have like steel cables bolted into the cliff face. So you have 2 carabiners and your body harness, your pelvis harness, and you clip one carabiner on above the cable anchor, and you pull the other one up, and you clip the second one, on, walk up to the next anchor, or climb or scramble up to the next anchor, or hang onto your cable for dear life as you go in your tennis shoes and you think, why did I do this in tennis shoes or hiking boots? Get to the next anchor, unclip your first carabiner, reclip it, unclip the second one, clip the second one, on up to the next anchor. Pretty cool stuff. Sometimes the infrastructure is the experience, sometimes the infrastructure just lets people safely and sustainably access that experience. Does that make sense? All right, so if I try to trick you on an upcoming quiz about the infrastructure being the resource and the experience, be careful with that. We want to have a very clear definition for each of these two classes of things. And there's a bajillion examples of both. So we'll get after all of that. All right, so that's 3 subparts to our human-oriented layers. What are we building now? What are we managing now? What are we preserving now? Okay? We are trying to help people access experiences through infrastructure that protects the cultural resources. And within cultural, we have 3 subtypes of that, even further down: archaeological, historic, and modern. Okay? So, these 3 cultural resource types show up in typically like at the name level of the place. So, for example, at Mesa Verde here, let's take a look at Mesa Verde.